Hi, everybody. Welcome to Halo Love and Country. I'm Richard Gayton. I'm a psychologist, writer, filmmaker sometimes, father, lover of dogs. And the person with me is...
Hi, Mitch McDonald, actor, screenwriter, but always happy to be here. Always happy to be here with Dr. Gate.
Well, here we are today. If you watch our series of podcasts, you've noticed we've talked about the risks of being LGBTQ in the military. We've then generalized more to the risks of speaking out in the current environment. And our topics have kind of morphed into what's going on in our country today. And from what I can see, we are definitely in a period of backsliding on democracy. Doesn't mean that that's a permanent sort of thing. And as I look back in history, I notice it's not permanent, but I've been doing a lot of reading and it's kind of helped reassure me a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. First, I started out reading about the Weimar Republic and how it came apart because it felt like I could feel the tearing of our democracy from many of the things that the current administration has done, from legal challenges, legal victories in the Supreme Court against democracy, the challenging of starting out by just challenging voting rights. Now we have the Supreme Court eviscerating voting rights. We had, of course, the January 6th insurrection that was then handled with pardons for the people who were justly convicted and having them now reconvicted of all kinds of other crimes, which does have a great ringing of the Weimar Republic and how fascism undermined that attempt to have liberal democracy, and finally led to the National Socialism or the Nazis coming to power. My latest reading has been about Ulysses S. Grant, and I want to recommend to you the biography of Grant done by Ron Chernow. It's in your library. It's a 1,000-page treatise on this man's life, which would normally be difficult for me to get through. It's taking me a lot of time, but I'm definitely getting through it and getting educated about the shadow that hangs over our country. In psychology terms, we would call it the shadow of the personality, which is the side of us that we may not have a great awareness of, or we may have some awareness of, but we wish it just wouldn't come out. And then sometimes in our darkness, we will embrace that shadow and begin to act out many of the very negative things about our personality. And then that shadow becomes an awareness, sort of, but we maybe lose track of how harmful and hurtful that shadow can be to ourselves and to other people. And to me, our country is now acting out that shadow of slavery, the shadow of a war which nearly destroyed our country, and which ultimately kept the country together. So if we go to where U.S. Grant is taking over the presidency, it's 1968. And if you think about it, that's 160 years ago, 150 years ago, which is like two huge generations, might say three. Could be if people live long enough then, probably many generations. But it's not that long ago.
20s.
Say again?
I count them in 20s. You're counting in 75s or so.
Hi.
You're doing lifespans.
I'm doing lifespan. There we go.
Yes.
Doesn't seem that long ago when I realized my grandfather was born in the 19th century, in the 1800s. My mother was born in 1910. So my grandfather was alive just after the Civil War.
Good
and
God.
Just a quick recap of the Civil War, which we fought over the South's decision to continue with slavery, the North's wanting to stop slavery, the South saying it had the right to secede, the North saying they didn't, and there was 700,000 people died in that conflict. And U.S. Grant was the general that brought victory to the Union side and was elected president of the country a few years after the Civil War, 1868. Andrew Johnson took over from Lincoln, who was assassinated. Most of us know all of this, but I'm reminding myself of it. And
Plenty
Johnson,
of us that don't know this information. Plenty of us.
plenty of us that don't know. And Johnson was the vice president under Abraham Lincoln. And he was kind of a compromise vice president because he was from the South. He was sympathetic to particularly Southern working class white folks. He was not that much in sympathy with the plantation owners, and he was against slavery. Except when he came into power, somehow he began to identify with poor white folks in the South and sort of had the ambition to be a wealthy planter himself. And so he was kind of had that mixed sort of thing and turned against Lincoln's view of and dream of black-white equality, political equality in the country. And Reconstruction was the attempt to reconcile the South to the Union and to protect black freedmen who were getting the right to vote, who are now newly freed slaves, who are rapidly becoming educated. There was tremendous strides as slaves, freed slaves were given education, were encouraged to become literate. Remember, they were all kept, not all, but they were in slavery. They were not encouraged anyway to become literate. Many slaves became literate while they were enslaved. But hundreds of thousands of black people were enrolled in school during Reconstruction. There had been 100,000 black soldiers in the Union Army who served honorably and were one of the main reasons the North began to win decisively. And now it's Reconstruction, and the North is insisting that the South have a democratic form of government, to have all people represented. And there were thousands of black legislators, tax collectors, postal employees, some governors, some senators, some congressmen, and the white population rebelled against this. And Johnson did very little to deal with that rebellion.
I want to jump in, just make as quick a point as I can make right here. All right, so historically, we're still talking about a period of time when the person who got the second greatest amount of votes would end up as vice president. It wasn't about necessarily having your chosen running mate for the second position. It was still the person who got the next amount of votes would end up as vice president. And that puts us in the situation where you have, and I assume it often ended this way. Obviously, you could have a situation where multiple people might be running for a position. So you'd have two people who were Democrats or two people who were Republican. Or, I don't know when the Whigs and the Tories and all that crap fell out. Well, and I say crap because at least they had multiple choices. So you're looking at a situation where somebody who he was running against ended up being a part of his party, or rather a part of his cabinet. Thank you. Ended up being a part of his cabinet. This is also part of that ongoing discussion of once upon a time, Democrats and Republicans held vastly different positions than they do now. They have gone through polar changes in their overall platform. Republicans at this time would have been very much in favor of making sure that the war ended the way it did, that black people were elevated in a way that made sense and maintained some control in the South by integrating people. And it would have been the Democrats who were very much against that. And as Johnson was a Democrat, it makes sense that he would have then been looking to be a planter, looking to underline what would be his own best interest in the way the South shook out. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. That's good. Yeah. And that's a good point. So Grant and Lincoln were considered radical Republicans. And it was considered, I think radical had kind of a different meaning back then, but it was radical now has a lot, well, because we have very specific radical points of view in this country, but I suspect we did then. Abolitionism, the abolition of slavery, was at one time somewhat of a extreme minority view in the country. But by the time Lincoln had come to power, it was becoming much more of a majority view, at least in the North. But the Democratic Party in the South was, again, just very much oriented towards slavery and black racism and this agrarian economy that was fueled by the free labor of slaves. So Johnson very much disagreed with Lincoln, but Lincoln was dead. So Johnson began to ease up on the Reconstruction. And Reconstruction involved federal troops being in all the southern states, all the rebellious states, and with very, very frequently military governors who enforced civil rights within the states. Johnson began to weaken that. And thus we have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan really began soon after the war was finished. And it particularly as Reconstruction began to really bring civil rights to black folks, where there really was education, there really was political power. That enraged many of the black people or the white people of the South. And at one time, it was estimated there was 2/3 of the white male population, 2/3 of the male population was actively involved in the Ku Klux Klan, 2/3. So, and many of these were ex-Confederate soldiers who took up arms. And for those of you who don't have just heard about the Ku Klux Klan, these were marauding groups of men with guns who burned black houses, murdered black folks, engaged in lynching and rape. And this was on a mass scale. There were several massacres, multiple murders of black men in the South. And Johnson took almost no action about that, even though there were still federal troops. He was very restrained. When Grant came into power, he was a hero of the Civil War. And when he heard these things, he sent federal troops to enforce. And there was a law, the Reconstruction law, to enforce those laws, and uninstalled some Southern governors. But during his 2 terms, tried to gradually reintroduce civilian rule within the South. As the southern states had to rewrite their constitutions in order to again be consistent with the American Constitution that all the states had adopted when we became, as we were going through the early national period. They had to rewrite their constitutions. Yes.
And I want to throw in there that despite, and as you were pointing out, Grant obviously understood and respected the need to defend the rights of the newly recognized black citizens. But I want to throw in there that he was also one of the main reasons that those Civil War marauders were even still in the picture. He was one of the ones who was pushing for the idea that these men fought for an idea. It was the wrong idea, but they are still people who belong in this country, and we should give them some leniency at the end of this war, which is a big reason they were even still there to go on marauding once we get to this phase. Why, when we're pushing into the Jim Crow era, they're still alive and they're still fighting because they still have their land, they still have their money. They've not had to pay a real price at the end of the war. I mean, if you lost your life during the war, that's a price. But, having lost your slaves, well, I mean, you shouldn't have had them in the first place. And now you have to, it's harder for you to work your land. You have to pay these people who you previously owned to work your land for you. You're not doing as well as you once were. But then you also have now been given the ability to mistreat them and push out the ones who are still belligerent and rebellious and demanding the rights that they've been told they have, which is, again, something we see pushing forward, to this day. It's an ongoing battle. And as far as I'm concerned, for purposes of this, it's only still a battle because we did not treat them like we would have treated any treasonous force, I feel like, to this day, at least currently. If we had an entire region of the country step away and start attacking the rest of the country, we would wipe them at this point. There would be jail time. There would be people thrown out of the country. Can't swear by that, obviously, because that's completely conjecture. But it's what you would hope for in the wake of everything else we have seen. All right, I'm sorry. Continue, please, sir.
Well, and there was much discussion about whether Robert E. Lee should be hanged for treason, and Grant did not want that, and he kind of made the deal at Appomattox with Robert E. Lee that they could be take a horse with them. The officers could take their weapons, and I think was it Sherman that made the same, somewhat even more lenient deal with Johnston when the other army gave up after Robert E. Lee's surrender. I guess I always thought that Robert E. Lee surrendered all the armies, but I guess Johnston was still he surrendered his army in more in the South where Sherman was. There was also talk of there was a very active movement to try Jefferson Davis for treason. And there were many people that thought that he was totally guilty for treason and should be hanged. And then Lincoln went back and forth about that. I'm not sure what his position was. I think it was not to hang him. But at one point, I believe he was imprisoned, but he was never tried. It was the whole approach was to forgive, assume that the South was really returning to accepting democratic values, at least the democratic values as promoted and encouraged in the Declaration of Independence and in the National Constitution. There was there was an overt agreement. If they returned to the Union, they would have to rewrite their constitutions like this. But that didn't mean it changed the hearts of those folks that fought for the Confederacy. It just means, from their point of view, they lost the war, but the fight would go on, and it did go on in the Ku Klux Klan. And I think it's not helpful to overlook how serious the Ku Klux Klan was in the South for many, many years, that there were thousands and thousands of marauders that terrorized and murdered Black citizens in the South. Not sure, those people eventually died out, but many of the ideas that they had continued. There's a whole historical revisionist history of the Civil War called the Lost Cause narrative, which has now become popular again among right-wing folks in the South, which somehow suggests that the Civil War really had nothing to do with slavery. It was just a states' rights issue. And I'd always been taught how important states' rights was as an issue. I mean, in a sense, because the South was saying, we're leaving, and the North was saying, no, you can't. So in a sense, there was sort of an overt states' rights issue. Do we have the right to leave? But no, it was all about slavery. It was all underneath, and all of that was the North's abhorrence of slavery and the South's wanting to keep it for economic reasons and for social reasons. So what does
And
that
I
have
think
to
you
do
can.
with?
I think you can still tie those things together on both sides. The idea that the North was had the moral high ground, and that the South was somehow full of these repugnant, racist slavers. Both of those things flip flop a lot. Because when it comes down to it, the North needed more control over the South. And as long as the South had the independence that was granted to them by the horrible activities that went on during slavery, the North couldn't really get that control. It gave the South the ability to resist. So taking it away shifted that footing. Certainly there were people in the North who were against slavery the same way there were certainly people in the South who were against slavery. So you can say that on one side it is a states' rights issue, but it's a states' rights issue driven by the right to maintain slaves. And on the other side, the desire to end that right to maintain slaves was driven by a need for financial control. So, either way you put it, anybody that tries to gloss over and say that slavery was not the motivating factor is still wrong. But those other pieces are important to that story.
That's an excellent point. So and so Grant comes in He uses federal troops to enforce Reconstruction in the South. There's a major massacre of black folks in Louisiana. There's the possibility, I'm not sure it was a likelihood, but there was a great possibility of the Confederacy taking hold again in places like Louisiana and South Carolina. So he sends federal troops in. Some what had happened, don't remember the exact incident, but there was an incident in Louisiana where the Ku Klux Klan massacred dozens and dozens of black men. Finally, it was the last straw, and Grant took over the state again, took over the state government. And there are many, many incidents of this, we call them white on black mob action, the use of force to suppress minority folks in this country. And the federal government was very effective in dealing with it, but not totally effective. Go ahead.
According to the Smithsonian, that was the 1873 Colfax Massacre. This one I'm not familiar with. Over 100 African Americans, mostly in the vicinity of the parish courthouse, killed by white supremacists, the White League, Ku Klux Klansmen, other folks, over a disputed election, which was obviously a common thing at that point because oddly, that's right in a time frame where after the war, black people, on top of just being freed, had started to move into elected positions. They were moving into government. And so you're looking at a gap between 1872 and 1900 where that was stripped away from them, where they went from being able to be elected to those Jim Crow moves being made to even stop them from being able to vote, and then shoving them out of government. So this one I'm not familiar with, but that's what the Smithsonian says.
And there were states where there was nearly a majority of black voters. That was very interesting. I didn't realize that. I think it was South Carolina. Again, I got that stuck in my mind. And it looked as if white folks were going to completely lose power in some states. In fact, they kind of did for a while because the federal government troops were able to enforce the laws of the land in the South. Now, and what does all this have to do with now? And you notice some of the issues we're talking about. We're talking about violence against black folks. We're talking about insurrection. Remember January 6th, we have not forgotten, which we had another white insurrection that took place. They just went straight for the Capitol at Washington, D.C. and tried to overthrow the government. And we have forgiveness again of this with multiple a blanket pardon of all of them, as if they were just engaged in civil war again. Very interesting. Again, we allow it to go, and these men are forgiven. They're allowed to go free. 5 police officers are dead, very strongly related to the actions of the January 6th insurrection. There's an attempt to sanitize it in history, very much like what happened to the Lost Cause, was tried to sanitize slavery and change history so it doesn't exist, so that this shadow of our country can go back into our unconscious, back out of our awareness. Because what was the law? Mitch, do you remember the law that was passed in Florida or someplace where we didn't want history taught in such a way that it would make white people uncomfortable?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of states right now arguing that it's part of the whole press against DEI. It's a whole press against DEI right now. It's, if we are teaching that a certain thing happened, we are somehow automatically teaching that white people are evil, or that the actions of your ancestors somehow show you to be evil to this day, which is an insane position to take. And there's very little that can be done about it because that's not what they want. They don't want to hear we are trying to avoid the repetition of errors. They just want to be held blameless for errors that happened before them that they know quite well they are ready to make again.
And what I'm positing is that no, we are not. I am not my ancestors. I probably had some ancestors you are not your ancestors, but we had those influences continue. I'm going to say that we have a national psyche. Now I'm not sure it's not literally true, but I think well, I don't know.
I mean, I don't,
Let's just call it that.
okay.
I'm going to, I'm going to call it with it. That's a name for it, for our psyche. And in psychology and in all of us, we have an unconscious, we have aspects of ourselves that are out of our awareness, that are a little bit in our awareness, or are totally, we can really bury things, bury obvious truths about ourselves, and pretend like they don't exist, or we can unearth them and change them in such a way that are not the truth of what happened before. And then we can actually be harder on ourselves because we remember facts, but then we interpret them in such a way that is very negative for our current lives, which is not helpful. If we use our unconscious as a way to be aware of what's going on in what some of our inclinations or some of the things that we've done, it becomes a way for us to heal and for us to face them and go on. And that's what I'm recommending for our country, is that we allow ourselves to be aware of what we have done, of what our ancestors did that hurt other people, but also helped and saved other people. What that is still there. Like, who would have thought, and maybe this is a cautionary tale for liberals, is to believe that somehow when Barack Obama was, and I felt this way, somehow when Barack Obama was elected, that our country had turned the page on racism. And the only way we turn the page on racism or on any of our really negative character qualities is to be fully aware of them and to take positive action to not repeat them. When we bury them, we're more likely to repeat them. And I think there was a lot of burying of racism when Barack Obama was elected, and a lot of belief that we didn't have to still deal with the leftover, particularly the economic leftover, and some of the police violence leftovers of racism. We somehow believed all that went away. I mean, I'd like it all to go away. I'd like the segregation of my hometown in California, in Long Beach, to not have happened. I would like the separate but unequal schools in my hometown in California not to have happened, but they did. And that was part of our psyche, and it is still part of our psyche, partially dealt with, but big chunk of it is not dealt with. And so it still comes out. And then we have, so in the individual psyche, some of the horror of our past comes out, some of the things we did that we're ashamed of or were harmful or whatever comes out. And then we have this huge reaction to it. Like, we have to tell a lie about it, pretend that it didn't happen, make it even worse. Oh yeah, I have racism in my background, but I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist while I again practice racism. That's the nature of the human psyche. That's the way we do things. It's very complicated. It gets complicated. We did it. We remember it. We try to not remember it, or we try to change the memory in such a way that we can still practice the very thing we're ashamed of. It's like it's part of human nature. It's part of our psyche. And that's what we're doing in our country now. That's what, with many, many of the folks who love Donald Trump, many of them are going through allowing the shadow, this dark past, to reemerge by calling it something else, saying the past didn't happen, changing the past into something that never was. All these are very wishing for a past that never happened. It's really complicated what the human personality can do. And it's very complicated what America has done. It's very complicated. We have revived racism as being okay. Amazing. Now, we won't say that. We've revised gross inequality as being okay. It's just okay. It's just capitalism. We've taken xenophobia, the hatred of people of different cultures. We've revived that. made it okay with ICE actions. And we have to
Well, I
accept
will,
what we do. Go ahead.
I'll counter you there. We
All
didn't
right.
revive it. It was never dead. It was never gone. It was quiet. And it was quiet because we passed laws that said it was inappropriate and wouldn't be accepted as action. And we had a big chunk of the population that was willing to stand up and say, that thing that you're doing, that is racist. That thing that you're doing, that is sexist. That thing that you're doing, that is homophobic. That thing that you're doing is religiously intolerant. We came full frontal against it, but there was no ending it because there were always going to be the remnants of those Reconstruction Civil War people, the ones we never completely removed, quietly still angry. The Klan never left. They were always there. I mean, how long? It wasn't that long ago that we were still pushing back against Catholics as if they were somehow an abhorrent group of people because of their faith. And it wasn't that long ago that we had soldiers coming back from wars in Asia with Asian wives, and we had people arguing about whether or not that was appropriate, or whether or not those people should be allowed in our society. I live in Fort Smith, Arkansas. At the end of the Vietnam War, they shipped a lot of people over here, basically people who had worked with us who needed some place to go because they were no longer safe in their own country because we got stomped. And they were sent here. They were rehomed, and a bunch of them were sent here to Fort Smith, Arkansas. They were taken to the Fort Chaffee base. They were not so much retrained as given a little. Basically, we needed a period of time to decide exactly what we were going to do with them. And then once we had decided, they just sort of dispersed across the country. Many of them stayed here. We have a very strong population of the Hmong people and the Vietnamese in general. We have a very large Asian population here because of that. But you also have a very large number of people here who are, it's odd to live right next to rednecks who will tell you that the muddying of white blood with these other races is unacceptable. And you have to point out to them that your wife is Asian or half Asian or quarter Asian. Your wife, her parents, at least one of her parents is Hispanic or Filipino or something. You're talking about this as if it's not, as if you're not involved in it. And even worse, you're talking against it while your literal blood stands next to you, and you're somehow teaching them to be self-hating by not recognizing or refusing to acknowledge that that thing exists within them as well. They are just human. And but yeah, you can see that. You can see that you can't throw a rock without running into one of these dudes around in my neighborhood. On the other side of the block from me, there are at least two Confederate flags flying. One of my dearest friends is married to a redneck who just thinks that Hispanic and black people don't try hard enough. That guy was on my list of friends for many, 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 many years. He has good qualities. We all chose to gloss over the racism that is in him because he's one of those who, he's one of those people who tell you you're one of the good ones, but he does it more on an almost ownership level. It's you're my friend. No one is allowed to mistreat you or call you anything bad because I know you're a good person. So I'll fight any other redneck that says it. But
Hmm.
other folks like you, not so much. Them I can talk trash about because I don't know them and they're probably not good. It's just, it's, as you said, it's a thing that exists within the psyche of our country. There are a lot of people who just think um, they are better than or would have been better than if it weren't for all these people showing up and taking things away from them as if that's what happened, as if something was taken away from. Wait a minute, hold on a second. Don't move. Don't go anywhere. I'm coming. 10 seconds. Talking about people having things taken away from them. All right. This is a picture of my great great grandfather, my great great grandmother. My father is very, very much, yeah, yeah, he's digging deeply into our lineage. And it
Hmm.
basically ends, that search ends right here at the end of the Civil War because it's hard to track black people on a good day back much further than that. This man was from Mississippi. he was freed by his enslaver. And his enslaver gave him a mule and an axe and said, everything that you can blaze in one day now belongs to you. Go at it. And he blazed a massive area. And when he was done, the man was true to his word and allowed him to keep everything that he had claimed. He signed it over to him. My great great grandfather at that point signed it over. He signed a chunk of it over, and I think it was like a quarter or a third. It was a very large piece. He signed over to the church, the black community's church. The rest, and that church and that land still exists today. That the church is still there. It is still worshipped at. But what happened was that it was a combination of problems. Descendants who were not good, basically who were well off and abusive of their opportunity, drank too much, gambled, basically reduced that chunk of land that the family still had left. And then there was a schism somewhere after the 1900s where they were forced off of their land. They ended up selling it for pennies on the dollar and were only able to buy a much smaller patch of land on what became the black side of town in McGee, Mississippi. They were forced out and they had to, and they bought what they could. They did the same thing again. My grandmother ended up selling half of the land that she bought so that the local school would have a place to be, land for a local school for the local black children. And then she built her homes on what was left of that land. But you're talking about probably a 90% reduction in what their wealth would have been through between a combination of dissipation and white rage. On my mother's side of the family, don't have a picture there. My mother's family lived in a community in Kentucky where they owned a mill and a bunch of land, and they were run out under pain of death. The family sort of fractured. Some of them went to Chicago, some of them went to North Carolina, but they left with nothing, not pennies on the dollar. They left with nothing and had to restart wherever they landed. So when you want to talk about people who look back at what was taken from them, there are a lot of people, a lot of black people who can say, a lot of Asian people who had to come here because of our activities in other countries, a lot of Hispanic people whose families own lands across the southwest of this country. There are a lot of people of color who can say what we had was taken by you, and it wasn't taken by you literally, but it was taken by your ancestors. And the fact that you don't have anything has nothing to do with us. We're fighting to get back what we once had, and you're unhappy that you don't have what you took from us, and then denied us the ability to get back.
Well, and maybe one way to look at this in terms of economic inequality is that there is kind of, with inherited property, is kind of the sins of the fathers are visited on the sins of the sons. There's this kind of quality of, as we know in our country, that white folks own more of the wealth, a lot more. And there are some very wealthy Black Americans, some very wealthy Hispanic, and probably many wealthy Asian Americans. But somehow most of the wealth ended up with white people. And so much of that is inherited wealth.
Yes, and for them it is still inherited wealth.
And then their wealth is protected by the system. But we don't want little white girls to feel uncomfortable with history. I think it's okay for us to be uncomfortable. Like, okay, so in psychotherapy, let's see, we're doing national psychotherapy here. So on the shadow side, so yes, white America, many of our relatives were slave owners, or many of them just participated in a system where they were protected and got special treatment and were able to use the lower status of Black folks to accumulate wealth. Well, and if we have well-developed superegos are the conscience, of the human personality.
Mm-hmm.
If we have developed superegos, it would condemn us for bad behavior. But in psychotherapy, using the superego to deal with the things we've done wrong is mostly useless and only produces guilt and shame and then all the reactions to guilt and shame. I mean, sometimes when we feel guilty, we'll do the right thing. But if we feel truly ashamed of it and there's nothing we can immediately see to do, or there's no way to undo the past, we can't go back and undo slavery. We can't go back and undo redlining of mortgages in California that kept Black folks from getting houses or kept them centered in South Central Los Angeles, or I just happen to know my history pretty well. We can't undo that. We can't stop that from happening in the past. If our
Right.
superego, because if our superego just says how wrong that was, and we go, oh, I feel so, all we get to do is feel bad. And there's a quality of us that knows that all that is useless, just feeling bad. But taking real action, like we could feel very bad about slavery. We could feel very bad that, and I think Grant felt very bad that the Confederacy was starting to rise again in the form of the Ku Klux Klan. But instead of feeling bad, he took action very quickly. He sent federal troops to Louisiana and tried to, I don't know how effective it was, to some degree effective. It didn't save those 100 men in Colfax because the men were already dead. It's too late to
Right.
save the dead. We can't save the slaves. But what we can do, what can we do now? What can be done now? In terms of 12-step talk, we talk about making amends for what we have done wrong in the past. The alcoholic drinks, he beats his wife, he hurts his children, he's irresponsible, he hurts his body, whatever. Now he decides to get sober. What can he do about the past? Well, he can wallow in self-pity, and you know where that leads to? Drinking again and hiding it all again and going back to hurting his wife, hurting his children, being irresponsible. That's where all that leads. And so if we just engage in shame, as liberals just go, we're so, what a bad thing we did. Oh, we're so bad. And then we make all the little white girls feel bad for their history. But we don't offer, because there's a certain logic to that, not just making people, there's a real psychological, logical logic to that. I'm not making people feel bad for their history, but maybe accepting truly that was a violation of our values as a country. That what about 90% of what Donald Trump does and says is a violation of the values of our country. We can be angry with him about it. People can do horrible things. Somebody tried to kill him again the other day. We can try to do that as if that as if that will have any positive effect whatsoever. Maybe it made that young man feel better for a little while. But it doesn't solve the problem of racism and inequality and the suppression of voices in this country. It doesn't solve that problem. But what does solve the problem, what does work, is teaching history as it really happened. And there's lots of good original sources about what really happened during slavery. There were a few slaves, yes, who learned how to read. There were many of them that were treated with great kindness and even identified with their masters and lived in the house and weren't beaten. There were many of those, but the vast majority were just oppressed people, and millions were beaten and raped. And it was just true. Just read the firsthand accounts and you can see it's mixed, but it ain't that mixed. It's pretty clear, and inequality in America is not very mixed anymore. It's mixed. I mean, there are very poor people, poor people of color that have made tremendous amounts of money, are now on top, or they're in the middle
Mm-hmm.
class. There are many of those. And the vast majority of folks of color are in the middle or the lower middle because of the way our system has been working lately. I mean, that's my impression. And I get to live in the upper 5%. That's where I get to live. So does it help if I feel bad about it? Not really. But it does help if I vote for medical care for everybody. And if I vote for a house for every freaking buddy. Everybody should be able to own a house in this country. Period. Period. I don't know. What's real practical stuff that can be done now? Everybody should be able to get a college education if they want one, or a trade school if they want, because we're rich enough to do that.
We are.
If we were living in Tanzania, no, we wouldn't be able to do that as a government. But our government is wealthy enough now to do that. So that's what I'm thinking, and I'm hoping that everyone will take the risk of taking action now, positive action, not hurting other people, but positive action to bring change. Vote, for God's sake. Vote for your school board, for your representatives. Vote, and throw out the ones that you have any doubt about. We're still a free country. Speak out. Who can you talk to? Respectfully, not to shame them. Remember what happens when we shame people, we shame ourselves, or shame, especially when we shame other people. When somebody tries to shame me, I have a big reaction. And I'm noticing, I don't know, Mitch, what are you noticing? I'm noticing very few Trump signs around anymore. And you've got two Confederate flags. I don't know. I have no idea what to do with that. But I see the country is changing. It's again reasserting its roots in democracy and in equality. I see it happening. But I'm eternally optimistic. And being at that upper 5%, I can afford to be eternally optimistic. What are you saying?
Well, your position, the basic argument that you're making here is 100% correct. Shame is a problem. It does generate more of this, it can generate more of the same problem. But the aspect of that we're losing in this conversation is these people aren't ashamed that they're racist. They're angry that their racism isn't winning. They are unhappy that the position they took could cost them something. Not because what they did caused damage, but because they have neighbors who are unhappy with them for creating a problem that created a problem for them. Their white neighbors now have issues with people around them who are like, he's one of y'all's, your people did this. And all they can say, well, no, he's just a member of my family. He's my neighbor. Outside this issue, he's an okay guy. I don't want to see him hung. I don't want to see him run out of the country. I don't want to see bad things happen to his kids. I don't want to see them become fatherless. But I don't know how you can really punish his actions. And the best thing to do at this point is let's not give him shame. He made a mistake and we're going to move on. He's going to make that mistake again. He's going to make that mistake over and over and over for the rest of his life because he knows he is right. And the shame he feels today is not associated to his wrongness. It is only associated to his failure. He didn't go hard enough. He didn't start voting early enough. He didn't push for the right candidates. But I will give you, there are a lot of those people who took down their signs who now see that the thing they were supporting was destructive. And there are a fair number of those people who deserve a little bit of grace. But determining who deserves grace and who doesn't is basically impossible. And that's where you end up in that Civil War situation of we should have just run them all out. And the ones we couldn't run out, we should have taken the power that they had away from them. We needed to underpin that voting was a right that belonged to everybody. And all these people who are in control, all these white people who are in control in these towns needed to be stripped of their land, they needed to be stripped of their money, and that money needed to be given to everybody else so that those people could rebuild and they could experience what it was like to be subservient to the people that they previously abused, because that is a driving factor. You'll see it in the arguments constantly. These people do not want to be treated the way they treated others. They understand how awful the things they do are. We need a direction that simultaneously recognizes their humanity but strips them of the ability to deny that humanity to others, because that is what they do.
And that is the last word on that. And thank you, Mitch, for making this happen, for producing this podcast. And
Glad to be here.
he was one of our wonderful actors in Love and Country. Go see the movie. You can see it on Tubi and on Amazon and Deku, and I don't know where else now. Still up there, chugging along. Catch my book, Love and Country, the background story of the characters. You can see how these characters emerged to go into the Vietnam War. There are two gay men who are in love during combat. So you have all that going on. Love and Country, both the movie and the novel. Thank you for being with us. Join us again on Halo, Love and Country. See you guys.
Oops.